The Jews were not passive. The Jews were very insistent, and the Jews were large in number. They were people, they were citizens of the Roman Empire who felt they had a right to make demands which they felt were legitimate. The Jews were not a passive, quiet people. They never have been. At the peak of the Roman Empire, the Jews were 10% of the population. 80 million population of the Roman Empire, 8 million Jews. It was not a small community, and they were a community that had a certain degree of influence and a certain degree of also relationships with the Roman aristocracy. They were making their demands, but the Roman emperor Trajan was head of an empire that had many problems. And by the way, Trajan's column is a very famous monument in Rome on the main road which leads from Piazza Venezia up to the great wedding cake monument of Victor Emmanuel. And there is Trajan's column, which is a gigantic column on which there are figures, carvings of the many campaigns he was involved in, and also a beautiful inscription of his deeds. And by the way, the Trajan column inscription is the standard for the finest form of Latin calligraphy and form of letters. In other words, if you study calligraphy, you take Trajan column as the first lesson. The Trajan column reflects some of the problems of the empire, and I believe that when the Jews said, we want your declaration of the temple to be rebuilt, I believe that there were Christians who came to him and said, don't let them rebuild the temple. And to him, Trajan, the year 117, Jews and Christians were two groups of Jews squabbling against each other. And why should he get involved in this problem? It's more trouble to tell the Jews rebuild the temple than he has to get involved in it than to say, look, I'm involved in many other problems. I have Germans rebelling in the north and these crazy Scotsmen and Britons and all that. So you see, the Emperor Trajan did not accede to the Jewish demands. I mean, this is my understanding of why the riots broke out in the year 117. After the passage of 70 to 70, you have 140. According to the Jewish tradition, the second temple was rebuilt 70 years after the destruction of the first temple. So now, approaching the year 140, the Jews begin again campaigning, and this time very strong campaigning, to the Emperor Hadrian. And they want the temple to be rebuilt. And now there's very strong propaganda on the part of the Christians. Don't let them rebuild the temple. And we know Hadrian had many problems. Hadrian, in fact, was the one who started to withdraw his forces from the outlying areas of the empire to get them back because the strain was too great. And now he's confronted with this conflict, and it must have been a serious conflict. And the Jews are really petitioning because they're saying, in effect, we must get the temple rebuilt in 70 years after the destruction of the temple. And now the Christians are saying don't. Now, how do we know that? There are letters that were written to the emperor, and we have the text, the letter of Barnabas and a few others, assailing the Jews and, complaining against the Jews, attacking them, and demanding that the emperor not permit the rebuilding of the temple. So we have this correspondence, it's in the writings of the church fathers, that the emperor was confronted with this conflict. The Jews say, rebuild the temple, we want to rebuild the temple, just give us permission, basically. And the Christians are saying, don't. And this eventually leads to the great destruction of the second rebellion, or the Bar Kochba rebellion. And the campaign must have started earlier because the Bar Kochba rebellion takes place between 132 and 135. So it's the Bar Kochba revolt. And the spiritual leader of the Jews at the time was Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kochba start the rebellion against the Romans, and it's 132 to 135. That is the second destruction of Jerusalem under the Romans, and the greatest. Now, What did the Christians want? They said, don't let the Jews rebuild the temple. Those burned beams and the blackened stones on top of the Temple Mount, that's very essential. We must preserve that as the symbol, the monument of the destruction of Judaism, the end of Judaism. The Bar Kochba rebellion, I believe, is the result of this Jewish demand, and really forceful demand, that the emperor it's your obligation to tell us we have to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. I mean, you must do it. And to them it was like a religious matter of greatest importance, because I believe they were basing themselves on the chronology of the rebuilding of the second temple after the destruction of the first one, and it was 47 years for the declaration and 70 years for the building. And since they were not getting it, they started this. But the propaganda against the Jews rebuilding the temple was clearly Christian, and we have the letters and we have the documents written at the time.